Chapter 1. When I first looked upon Frey, I knew not whether I should marvel at the steam city, or weep for the blood it had cost. Travel Journals of Lord Reginald Blackrook. A ferocious wind roared under the blanket of dark clouds that hung low over the city of Frey, and carried with it a new flurry of snow, blocking out the pale light of the 3 small moons. The snow darkened as it mixed with the thick columns of smoke that emerged from the hundreds of chimneys that dotted the rooftops and factories of the city. The only lights that brought any warmth to the cold city were the numerous lamps that lined its cobblestone streets. The static orange hues of the gargantuan airship docks nestled within the hollow mountain that stood vigilant at the back of the valley the city sat within. The black snow found its way into every street corner and building that had even the smallest of openings. From the manors and cathedrals that dotted the center of the city to the shanty towns and thrown-together inns that built up the city's slums. Inside a decrepit bar within the inner slums, wedged between the towering rustic buildings around it, past the tarp-covered holes and the piles of slush that had built up in the corners, Nathan turned uncomfortably in his sleep, pulling a thin blanket around himself tightly to try and ward off the cold. Despite the harrowing new layer of snow that assaulted the city, it still awoke before even the first rays of sunrise peeked over the horizon. Machinery slowly cranked to life as colossal gears began to turn around the city, and the whistle of escaping steam screamed from the factories. Horses, pushed on by the crack of whips, forced their way through the snow while pulling squeaking wagons behind them. Grunts and yells of frustration filled every street as boots, some too heavy or light to be human, slogged through the snow and slush. Every sound reached through the thin walls of the old bar and woke Nathan as if they were all a natural alarm clock. Nathan rolled over, groaning. His back popped painfully as it shifted on the worn floorboards underneath the thin mat that was his bed. He kept his eyes closed for a few moments longer as he brought his legs up closer to hide them under his short blanket, hoping for just a few more moments of sleep. That hope was quickly dashed by a loud bang against the wall nearest to him. His eyes snapped open, he jumped to a crouch, his pulse quickened, and his senses immediately honed in on the source. The angry screams and the beating of fists against some poor bloke on the other side of the wall lasted only a few seconds before they stopped, and the sound of the city's steady hum of people, factories, and carts filled the room. Nathan sighed and rubbed his eyes. Just another day in Frey. A shiver ran up his back, and a small white cloud passed his lips, invisible in the dark room. He pulled his blanket up and held it tightly around his shoulders as he reached for the small box of matches next to his mat. "Mornin', Lena," Nathan said through chattering teeth as he fumbled with the box of matches, trying to light one with stiff, frozen fingers. No answer came from the other side of the curtain that divided the tiny, closet-sized room. He wasn't surprised. His younger sister always managed to sleep later than he did. With a strong flick that nearly broke the match, a tiny flame sizzled to life. He quickly lit the candle next to the mat and held the flame close, trying to thaw out his hands one finger at a time. The dim flame wasn't strong, but it was enough to faintly light the tiny room and the single half-filled cabinet drawer in the corner. Nathan looked at the curtain while listening to the howling wind on the other side of the wall, trying to guess the weather. "Sounds like it's a bad one this morning, eh?" Nathan asked, holding the candle a little closer to feel some warmth on his cheeks. Again, he was only met with silence from the other side of the curtain. "Lena, it's time to get up," he said in a more serious tone. He braced himself when he still didn't hear any shuffling, hoping she would be there. He held his breath and pulled the curtain aside. On the other side was a second mat that was a little more stuffed than his own, and even had a small pillow. The bed, however, was empty. Nathan nearly dropped his precious candle at the sight of the empty mat. "Lena, please don't be doing this again." He stood, quickly jamming his frozen feet into the worn leathery boots next to his bed, and briskly left the room, keeping his candle held out before him to light the way. The next room was just as dark as his own, and the candle could only create a small orb of light around him, but he knew the room's layout by heart. An old table with a replaced leg was pushed against the iron wall along with 3 wobbly chairs, and a small chamber pot sat at the furthest end, sectioned off by another patchwork curtain. On the table sat an old radio, and under it was a third mat. Nathan left the room, and the stale half-eaten bread loaf that sat on the table, without hesitation, despite his growling stomach. He didn't have time to eat if he didn't know where Lena was. The next room was the last and largest in the building. Several tables were set out before the long bar that lined the back of the room. The rows of scratched-up bottles behind the bar were covered in a thin layer of frost. Through the icy front windows, Nathan could partially see the hazy, marching silhouettes of the never-ending crowds outside. Nathan extinguished the candle and put it down on the closest table, quickly pushing it a little to the side to stop the wax from being dripped on by the icicle-covered pipes that snaked across the bent ceiling. He glanced about the room quickly, spotting only one other person in the room. The pale-skinned man was in his mid-40s, but he looked older than he should have. He hunched over the bar like several weights had been tied to him. Gray crept into his short brunette hair, and his bright blue eyes and cheeks were sunken into an already thin face. Patched-up clothes hung loosely, even though they were a size too small for him. If it wasn't for the large coat hanging from the man's squared shoulders, he'd look like he could have been blown over by a breeze. A metal brace wrapped tightly around his right leg, and a matching iron cane rested upon the bar top. Close to the man was a very crumpled black and white photo of an orc, a few humans, and a young human woman. The man was in the photo, and, much like the building Nathan called home, had seen better days. Nathan's jaw tightened and his hands balled into fists. Lena wasn't there, and that meant trouble. He glanced at the man, wondering if he could sneak past him. He sighed, knowing he wouldn't make it to the street without being noticed. Bracing himself, he walked over to the bar, trying to pat down his wild raven hair into a presentable level of neatness, and took the open stool next to the man as he was gazing intensely at some yellowed paper spread across the chipped wood. "Morning, Dad," he said as he swept some fallen paint flakes from the bar top. His father jumped slightly, scattering his papers. His hand twitched towards his thigh for a moment before he recognized Nathan and calmed down. "Morning, Nathan. Sorry, I didn't notice you there. You really are too quiet at times." His father's blue eyes, the only hints of color on his pale face, met Nathan's dark forest green for a moment before he turned to scoop up the papers. Nathan quickly knelt to help gather up the papers. He didn't bother looking over what was on them. It all just looked like gibberish to him anyway. Mr. Verloren stopped suddenly, pausing from sorting his papers into neat piles, and looked at Nathan with an arched brow. "Where is your sister?" he asked, a suspicious note in his voice. Knowing his father would get the answer sooner or later, he told the truth. "I'm not sure. She must have woken up before us and gone out. Knowing her, though, it's probably to cause trouble somewhere," he said, looking towards the front door, itching to get out there and find her. Mr. Verloren leaned over the bar and buried his face into his hand, a movement that brought a metallic squeak from his brace. "Every time I look away from that girl," he mumbled. He ran his hand through his hair and returned his gaze to Nathan. "Go look for her before she does something we'll all regret. I'll send word to Chief Matthews just in case." Nathan's stomach dropped. If Lena got in trouble with the police again. "I'm sure she's not doing anything too bad. She probably just went to see Miss Stroller," Nathan said quickly, jumping to his sister's defense on instinct, even as he grimly remembered the damage she had caused the last time she went out on one of her excursions. "Go," Mr. Verloren ordered, not acknowledging Nathan's attempted defense. "Stay to the main streets today, and don't wander outside of the district. If you see a lot of Blue Nooses members in the area, don't hang around, and come back here right away. Understand?" "I'll check our usual spots first," Nathan nodded. He took a few steps towards the door, then stopped and looked back. The chairs still sat, either stacked up in a snow-covered corner or on top of tables, and with the bottles frosted over, it would take longer than usual to get them ready for the day. His gut told him he needed to find Lena, but it nagged at him to leave his father like this. He knew how hard it was for the crippled man to do things alone. Are you going to be okay this morning? Nathan asked, not trying to hide the concern in his voice. I can manage a few morning chores. Mr. Verloren straightened up and forced a smile, an all-too-familiar smile that never fooled Nathan. Just go find your sister. Dad, you look more exhausted than usual, Nathan said, pointing towards the heavy bags under his father's eyes. They were larger than they normally were. I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine. There's just been a few late-night meetings lately. Nothing to worry about. With your friends again? Nathan growled in a low voice. The idea of those people made his blood boil and brought some much-missed heat to his cheeks. Mr. Verloren sighed sadly. Unfortunately, yes. The scuttlers and the high-rope gangs had a street war break out on the west side recently. I've been renegotiating some terms. I want to be on the good side of whoever comes out on top. Unfortunately, the Blue Nooses are trying to take advantage of the commotion to stake out more territory, so that's muddying the situation. On top of that headache, for some reason, military patrols are prodding unusually close, instead of sticking to their usual routes. As you might imagine, people are getting a little jumpy. On the bright side, they're probably going to break out the good drinks for tomorrow's meeting. Dad! Nathan snapped angrily, his lips curled back to show his sharp incisors, which were far sharper than any human's should be. His father quickly held up his hands in defense. Jesting, Nathan, jesting. I won't touch a drop. Now please, find Lena. Until those patrols get back to their normal routes and things quiet down, we need to keep a low profile, I know. Nathan quickly finished the sentence he had heard since he could remember. He glared at his father until the man nodded solemnly. I won't touch anything. Good, Nathan said curtly. I'll go look for Lena. He turned on his heel and walked out the door. Just before he shut it, however, he looked back over his shoulder. His father had already turned back to his papers. The man's shoulders slumped as he rested his head in his hands. He felt his earlier anger drain away. He didn't want to leave his father to handle the bar alone, no matter what the man claimed, but they both knew the trouble Lena could cause. He stepped away from the building and pushed his worries to the back of his mind so he could focus on his task. Blackened snowflakes and a bone-chilling wind pelted him the moment he stepped into the narrow street and the trails created in the knee-high snow by the morning crowds. The smell of rotting manure, mixing with smoke, assaulted his nose as he pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame. While he blew some warm air past his chapped lips into his hands, an idea sparked from his earlier defense of his sister. He turned a corner and started for the district's main square, the fastest path to Miss Jorla's shop. He didn't expect to find Lena there, but maybe the weaponsmith might have seen her earlier and have an idea of where she'd gone. Out of the way! A voice suddenly yelled behind Nathan. Nathan jumped to the side, pressing his back against the cold bricks of a tanner's workshop. A horse-drawn carriage raced past, splashing icy black snow over him. The carriage nearly barreled over several others as it raced on, the yells of the driver the only warnings most were getting. Oi, lend to use the road! Nathan shouted after the carriage, shivering terribly. His voice, like the coachman's yells and the carriage's rustic wheels, was lost in the myriad of voices around them and the bursts of whistling steam that came from the cage-like network of pipes that ran above his head, which wove into and strangled every brick-lined building in the city. The street wasn't nearly wide enough to be a real road through the district, but at least most wagons and stagecoaches knew to stay in the center when they rolled down their sad little part of it. Nathan hastily brushed the snow off before it could melt further down his back. The black snow turned what may have once been a white shirt into an even darker gray and added a new smell to his usual unpleasant stench. Still another week before I can afford a bath, Nathan grumbled to himself, remembering how expensive the public bathhouse in the district was. And if you come any closer, I'll throw you under the next one, he suddenly said loudly. It was a mock threat, but it was enough to stop the 3 small urchins behind him who were reaching for his empty pockets. Nathan didn't need to turn around to know they had already scurried off to find a new target. If there was one thing he could recognize from 1,000 leagues away, It was a pickpocket. He knew all their tricks by heart. He turned a corner, patting and clawing the last bits of snow from his clothes, and started to fight his way through a thick crowd. It wasn't large, but it was enough to clog the narrow back street. Cursing his short stature, he stood on the tips of his toes to try and see what had drawn the crowd. The people were all engrossed by a blond man on a tall crate who was spewing fire from his mouth and into his hands. He shaped the fire as though it were clay and juggled the flaming shapes high into the air. Some people clapped as a courtesy, or even tossed a few bronze knots into an overturned hat at the man's feet. Everyone did shuffle a little closer to enjoy the ever-precious commodity of heat the juggler provided. Whenever the juggler saw his crowd start to shrink, another flaming shape would be added to bring a wave of heat for his patrons to enjoy. By the time Nathan pushed through to the other side of the crowd, 6 flaming items were being flung high into the air. As that wonderful heat became only a lingering touch on his back, he dimly wondered what kind of magic the man was using. Was it pure magic? Or was the juggler like himself and using blood magic? That would certainly explain how easily the man breathed and shaped the fire despite being so young. Nothing like the few wizened mages he had rarely glimpsed before. Without the crowd blocking his way, Nathan quickly reached Miss Jorla's smithery. Smoke and steam were already bellowing out of the multiple chimneys of the small one-floored building. The entire city could wake up early, and Miss Jorla would already have columns of smoke reaching the clouds. Inside, he could hear powerful bangs of a hammer on metal. Even before he reached the door, the smell of smoldering iron crashed over him and overwhelmed every rotting odor the streets normally held. Nathan opened the smithery's crooked door, which had clearly been ripped off and poorly replaced multiple times. His muscles immediately relaxed as he basked in the wonderful heat. A longing sigh escaped his lips before he even realized. Even on a good summer day, it could never get as warm as the smithery was at that moment. At the other end of the shop, hunched over an anvil and beating on it with a hammer the size of Nathan's head, was the massive bulk of Miss Jorla. She was covered in a thick layer of hazel fur that barely hid her sheer muscle. Her burned smithing apron and ash-smeared clothes had trouble holding themselves together, threatening to rip their seams with each swing of the hammer. The troll paused briefly. "If you're here for the mice, you'll have to wait until tomorrow. It's not ready," she said without turning around. She continued to pound the anvil hard enough to cause the dirt around its base to jump. Nathan snapped out of his heat-induced daze with a small shake. "It's actually me, Miss Jorla," he called cheerfully, smiling large enough to show his fangs. The rhythmic hammering stopped, and the mass of muscle turned around, revealing a face free of hazel fur, the only part besides her hands that was. 2 beady black eyes lit up, a stubby tail wagged slightly, and a large smile erupted on her face. Though the 2 tusks that jutted upward from her lower jaw made the expression seem more terrifying than friendly. "Nathan! Good to see you, lad!" Miss Jorla called excitedly. She dropped the hammer to the ground and casually tossed the glowing metal on the anvil back into the furnace. The troll crossed the building in several large strides, leaving giant boot prints on the dirt floor behind her, and scooped Nathan up with a single arm. Nathan wheezed, the smoky-smelling hug nearly snapping him in 2, but he embraced it wholeheartedly. When Miss Jorla finally let him go, he nearly collapsed, his legs having gone weak and tingly. "What are you doing here so early? Shouldn't you be helping your father open up for the day?" Miss Jorla asked, hardly noticing Nathan's near crushing. She reached a long arm over and patted him on the shoulder. Nathan gritted his teeth as his knees buckled under the weight of the troll's hand. "Lena snuck off somewhere while we were sleeping. My dad wants me to find her before something happens. Again," Nathan said, rubbing his now sore shoulder. Miss Jorla scratched her chin. "Little troublemaker, that one," she said warmly. She straightened up slightly, only to bump her head on the ceiling, leaving yet another dent. "Gah, cheap building," she grumbled as she rubbed her head. With a grimace at the ceiling, she walked back to the furnace. "Have you seen her by any chance?" Nathan asked hopefully, almost having to jog to keep up with her. "Afraid I haven't, dear. Miss Jorla said as she peered into the furnace.
Not yet.
She looked back to Nathan, her face now a little darkened from the smoke.
You may want to try Buckingham. Perhaps he's seen her.
Thanks, Miss Jorla. What are you making this time? Nathan asked, curiously peering into the furnace. Normally, she used one of the several smaller furnaces tucked away on the sides of the building. When she used her central furnace, he knew it would be something special.
A mace,
Miss Jorla said proudly, smiling broadly.
A member from the Talons lost his on a hunt, and he wants a replacement. It's such a nice change of pace. Everyone wants sword this, sword that. No one appreciates the other weapons, especially the mace.
She reached over and took a troll-sized mace down from one of the walls and smashed it down on the floor, sending chunks of dirt flying into the air and onto Nathan.
It's actually a far more eloquent weapon than most people give it credit for,
she said, gazing lovingly at the small crater she had made. Good luck with it, Nathan said, brushing the dirt off himself. He turned to go, wishing he could stay longer with Miss Jorla and her sweltering furnaces. But Lena took precedence over everything else. She always did.
Come by this afternoon if you can, dear. I'll make you some tea,
Miss Jorla called as he walked out the door.
I will if I can,
Nathan answered, hoping he could. The pleasant conversation's effect on his spirit drained away as Miss Jorla's shop disappeared from his view. His smile quickly faded when he noticed the black snowflakes falling harder. He stopped and studied the sky for a moment, having to step to the side to avoid being dragged away by the crowds. Where are you? He thought desperately, noticing the darkening clouds. By his best guess, he only had till late evening before the weather started to turn. He had to find her before then. The streets were too dangerous during a storm to wander them alone. With each spot that turned up empty, his anxiety grew, and by the time the cloud-covered sun was high overhead, he found himself in the district's center, having run out of hiding places. He ran his hand through his dark hair, brushing snowflakes from it and trying to think of anywhere else Lena could have gone. He paced about, his muscles tensing as he mentally combed over every spot or person he knew Lena went to, and even a few he frequented. He had been to everyone they knew, and all their secret hiding spots. Where could she be? He wandered about the enormous courtyard, nearly ready to pull out his hair in worry. Eventually, his gaze fell on the largest building in the otherwise open center, one brightly colored enough to draw anyone's eye when compared to the terraced buildings around it. It was a castle that soared over any of its neighbors. Lines of windows cut into fortifications that were originally solid. Ornate archways decorated its roofs. Towers peeked over the city landscape, and a marble staircase led up to a large double set of doors. An iron gate surrounded every walkway and garden in its yard, and with its constant patrol of police, it was the most secure building Nathan knew of. It had been built long before the city sprouted up around it, and had since been converted into a home for the Fable family, the latest of the minor nobility to fall from grace and be given the unenviable job of governing their lowly district. Though he had never actually seen anyone use the house other than their servants. Rumor had it they lived in a mansion in the mountains, and left the actual governing work to their master of servants. Nathan didn't bother to hide the small sneer that escaped his lips at the sight of the castle, and made a gesture that he was certain his father would have scolded him for. He knew it wasn't worth wasting his time on, but the small act of rebellion helped give him an outlet for his frustrations. He sighed, his flicker of anger giving way to his rapidly growing worry. "Where are you, Lena?" he bemoaned, resigning himself to recheck all her usual hiding spots in case he had overlooked one. As he turned to leave, he noticed the whipping flags that hung from the poles at the top of the castle's towers. Like every flag in Frey, they held the royal emblem of the House of Vieira, a red and black drake that held a ring of iron in its jaws. But the emblem had been cut apart, and blue splotches of paint had ruined the black and red cloth. When he looked over the building again, he noticed rock-sized holes in several of the lower windows, and a few scaffolds that were being set up near the few higher windows that had shattered. A handful of bundled-up officers were talking to some people on the stairs,
small notebooks in their hands and pencils working furiously. In a perimeter around the main gate were several orcs, roughly questioning anyone who got too close, their gruff voices carrying over on the building wind whistling down the streets. "Lena!" Nathan hissed accusingly through gritted teeth. He marched towards the despicable building, already certain of the identity of the culprit. Once he was a stone's throw from the gates, and only had a large group of fearful-looking goblins partially obstructing his view, he was able to see that not only were the orcs armored, but they had 3 white claw marks painted across their breastplates and helmets. Nathan stopped cold, feeling his stomach drop at the sight of the mercenaries, and he was suddenly filled with the urge to turn and run the other way. Talons! He panicked, darkly remembering how his last encounter with them ended. Why couldn't the governor have hired the Scuttlers instead? At least they'd try to be diplomatic, he thought. One of the orcs stopped beating a goblin on the ground before them and looked up for a moment. Nathan's heart skipped a beat when he worried the orc recognized him, but the mercenary quickly went back to work. Nathan relaxed only slightly. If they had recognized him, they would have happily stopped beating the goblin and gone after him. It meant they were new to the mercenary band, or from a branch so far off they didn't know what he had done. An idea popped into his mind. He tried to dismiss it, but like the ever-present layer of filth on him, it stuck. If those particular talons didn't know, he might be able to get information out of them. They always had their hands in the news that traveled by radio or hastily paid street urchin. They might know who had attacked the governor's house, and which way they had gone. But what if he got closer, and one of them did recognize him? A distant boom of thunder snapped him from his worries. Lena! He needed to find her before the weather turned even worse, and if the Talons knew anything, then it was worth the risk. Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat and put together a plan on how to approach them. Like everyone else on the street, he did what he could to ignore the beating happening in front of him. He recognized the goblin from one of the pro-goblin groups wanting citizenship. The poor bloke didn't deserve the fury of the orcs. But he, more than most in Frey, knew the cost of helping someone when the Talons had their eyes set on them. "Get lost!" one of the orcs yelled in his native tongue, throwing the beaten goblin before the rest of his group. "The Fables aren't seeing anyone without authorization." The orc looked at the group of goblins and roared, causing them all to scatter like green-skinned rabbits. "The many take those damn things," another one of the orcs snorted as he watched them run. "You'd think they'd learn," the orc who had thrown the goblin grumbled. He looked over and spotted Nathan. "What do you want, boy?" he growled. Nathan hastily put on his most nervous-looking expression, his posture changing significantly. He took a few nervous steps. "Stay calm and act like any other street urchin. No one thinks twice about them," he thought to himself. He purposely stammered out, allowing some of his real fear to leak into his voice to help sell the act. These Talons might not recognize him, but he was ready to run regardless. The orc took a few aggressive steps towards Nathan, towering over him enough that he had to crane his neck just to meet the eyes of the ashen-gray face that looked like it had been carved from a rock. Being so close to a Talon made his hair stand on end. His mind's senses instinctively searched for nearby metal to assist him in his flight. "Do you have business in there?" the orc asked sharply, still speaking his native language. No, not at all," Nathan replied, disconcertingly in the orc's language. "What happened here?" he asked, looking from the building to the orc quickly and trying to sound innocent. "None of your business, so get!" The orc shoved him to the ground, causing Nathan to skid across cobblestone and ice. Nathan kept calm, not allowing the act to drop in front of the orc. He kept his eyes downcast, rubbing his sore elbows, and spoke quickly. "I just wanted to help, sir. I came down from the other side of the district and figured that maybe if I knew what they looked like, I might have seen them. For a few knots." The orc approached him again. "I said get lost, rat!" He howled and raised his boot. Nathan was willing to put up with a lot, but he wasn't going to get kicked by a steel-toed boot. Magic rushed through his arm, creating a tingling feeling over his skin. He focused on the metal of the orc's armor and— Enough! A new voice cut through the air, speaking in the orc language. The orc stopped, still eyeing Nathan. Nathan didn't let the orc out of his sight, but he let the magic that was surging through his arm fade away. The tingling feeling dwindled to light pricks at his skin. He cursed quietly when he noticed the look of understanding on the Talon's face, who had undoubtedly figured out the act. He watched the orc worriedly. If the Talon spoke to his superiors, and they in turn realized that it was him, he shuddered at the thought. Why did he think this was a good idea again? "What's your name?" the orc asked quickly before the constable reached them. "Renal Colin, sir," Nathan said, acting in a defeated manner. The human constable reached the two, his dull brown eyes trying to burn a hole through the orc's skull. "The captain wants a word with all you Talons. I'll handle the kid," he ordered harshly in the orc language. The orc looked over at Nathan and smiled. He walked away without a word, not even sparing a glance at the red-headed man. Nathan watched him go, hoping the fake name and his defeated tone would be enough to satisfy the orc's pride, and he would quickly become lost in the group of others the orc had beaten that day. The constable looked down at Nathan, his expression remaining grim. The shadows under his eyes seemed to add further depth to his scowl, and made it clear he was in no mood for disobedience. "Your act fell apart at the end," he added sharply, speaking in human. "I can only keep it up for so long," Nathan said, returning to his normal self. "And you wouldn't need to keep it up in the first place if you would stay away from the Talons like I told you. Now get up." "That was the first time in— Never mind." Nathan let the defiant statement die off as he picked himself up from the ground, standing back up to his full, if diminutive, height. "You okay, Jack? You look worse than usual," he asked, concerned by the man's beaten-down appearance. Jack groaned and rubbed his eyes. "Not in the slightest. The chief has had everyone working overtime for days now looking for some escaped convict. And this," he jabbed at the damaged building, "is not making my week any better. Things are bad enough with another street war breaking out. We fished 5 bodies out of the unfrozen parts of the river just this morning with high ropes calling cards all over them, and several warehouses burned down when the scuttlers attacked a factory the high ropes control." Jack pointed at the orcs harder than necessary. "And now on top of all that, the Talons have been brought in as extra muscle on the streets. I'm certain you can already guess how that's going." "They trust mercenaries more than their own down here," Nathan spat with a hint of venom, as he spotted a few familiar rotten cops on the stairs talking to the Talons. "Can't really blame them," Jack grumbled, adjusting his constable cap. "Anyway, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be at the bar with your dad and—" He stopped and looked at Nathan suspiciously. "Relax, Jack," Nathan said lightly. "I'm just out to buy a few things. Some supplies ran low." He lied effortlessly. "This wouldn't be the first time she's stirred up trouble. If I find she had anything to do with this—" "She's at the pub. You know you can trust me." Jack looked unconvinced and crossed his arms. Nathan gave his best smile. "Jack, you know she's the liar of the family. Trust me, all right?" He walked away and disappeared into the crowd, mumbling to himself, "Lena, I'm gonna kill you." Once he was sure he was out of Jack's line of sight, he moved into a narrow alleyway in between the buildings, so he could think without fighting the crowd. Again, he went through his mental list of all of Lena's spots, trying to think of anything he might have missed. A cart filled with fish passed by, and with the rotten smell a sudden realization came to him. The docks. It wouldn't be the first time Lena had snuck over there to watch the ships. With an apology to his father, he set off for the docks. It didn't take long for the smell of the neighboring district to waft over him, and soon shops and stalls filled with cuts of fish from salmon to trout started to appear on the sides of the streets. The docks, just like the city, stretched across the entirety of the 2-kilometer-wide river. With the city nestled in a valley, the river acted as a natural barrier for it. A dozen bridges spanned its frozen banks,
and lines upon lines of steam-bellowing boats made their way through the frigid water at the river's flowing center. The glowing runes that floated around each of the vessel's steam stacks made them almost seem like moving light posts on the river. On the other side of the river were dozens of mills with frozen water wheels and factories with sludge pipes emptying into the river. At their sight, Nathan was glad the ice and snow had taken some of the sting off the river's usual rancid smell. Beyond the mills and factories was a field of construction equipment and train tracks that wove between sections of ruined and abandoned buildings that sat on the edge of the ring plains. Nathan prowled the docks, asking vendors if they had seen his sister, and passed boats frozen in place with crews sitting around fires on their decks. Like the rest of his search, his efforts were fruitless, and he was only left shivering and more worried. When the wooden piers turned into dry docks filled with half-constructed hulls, he gave up. Lena never traveled this far from home. As he turned to leave the docks, he glanced once more at the buildings across the river and tried to see the plains behind them. He smiled at the thought of what was beyond them. One day, he told himself more times than he could count. One day he would see what was beyond them, and he was taking his father and Lena with him. His smile disappeared the instant when his eyes fell upon it. It sat just on the horizon, barely visible. It had been there all his life, an unmoving, unchanging silhouette of a lone mountain that seemed to cast its shadow on the whole island. The mountain seemed to capture him, rooting him in place as his eyes focused and brought it into more clarity than he wanted. Framed by the ruins that lay just beyond the mills and factories, it seemed like, for a moment, he could see into that terrible day, the day the world almost died. The distant mountain had him so transfixed that he jumped into the air and yelped when a gunshot cracked through the air. He quickly looked around to try and pinpoint where the shot came from, just catching a body falling onto the ice of the river. People screamed and ran to get away as others rushed into the middle of the street, crashing into each other in a flurry of fists and beating sticks. A second gunshot rang out, and he ran. His heart quickened as the fighting grew, but he stayed calm. It was hardly his first street fight, and he knew it wouldn't be his last. He barely skidded around the icy patch at the bottom of a corner street lamp when he was nearly trampled by a stampede of police and Talons. He didn't watch what happened next, and he didn't stop running until he was several streets over. The snow was starting to turn into sleet, and in the distance, the thunder became more frequent. Nathan shielded his face from the stinging ice and ducked into a small alleyway for cover. His deep breath split his chapped lips and drew blood. He wiped it away while trying to flex his cold fingers, feeling tiny jolts of pain jump from them. "Lena, where are you?" he huffed, frustrated. For a moment, he considered returning to his father. Maybe she was back at the bar and just waiting for him. It had to be well past noon by now, and she couldn't have been gone that long, right? "Another hour, or sundown," Nathan said to himself, his breathing returning to normal. Lena would be out till midnight if he didn't drag her back. He stepped out to start his search anew, resolving to check all of Lena's spots again when someone slammed into him. They sprawled across the ground in a tangle of limbs as a large pouch fell from his assailant's hands with a loud jingle. The two quickly separated from each other, and he got a good look at who had crashed into him. She was a human girl, only a year younger than himself, though he didn't have much height over her. Her light skin was red around her cheeks and nose, like she was starting to come down with a cold, and she shivered terribly. Her long brunette hair was dripping with water, creating large splotches on a heavy coat that did what it could to bulk up her tiny frame. She put a hand on her head, cradling it slightly.
Why would you just pop out of an alley like that? Watch where you're going, you git.
She looked up and glared at him with teal eyes. She gasped, and her eyes shifted into darker sapphire hue. "Nathan?" Nathan suddenly felt ecstatic at the sight of the girl, and filled with a need to yell at her. "Lena!"